Welcome to meeting number 140 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. We'll start with Mr. Genuis, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to really thank both of our witnesses for their testimony. I want to share with you that people in my constituency are seized with the importance of advancing truth and reconciliation, and as part of that, with promoting and supporting economic development in Indigenous communities. We want to make the system better. We want to do more to promote economic development, and it is in that spirit that we pushed for this study to take place. I also want to highlight that this committee has been studying procurement abuses in general. We've seen serious problems with procurement under this government, and our goal is to strengthen procurement to provide more benefit for Indigenous peoples, for all Canadians, and for taxpayers as well. Now, Minister Hajdu told the INAN Committee in March that the federal government's Indigenous contracting program has one objective: to verify Indigenous identity. She said, quote, "The Indigenous Business Directory is to provide assurances to other departments, including Public Services and Procurement Canada, that the people on that list are Indigenous. That is the sole purpose of the list," end of quote. Meanwhile, while she was telling this to a committee, according to Revelations in Global News, her officials were telling applicants that all they had to do to verify Indigenous identity was upload a picture of a bunny. Now, we've all heard the expression, "you had one job." One job, according to the minister, to verify Indigenous identity. And then all you had to do to verify Indigenous identity was to upload a picture of a bunny. This committee ordered documents on subcontracting because when you get an Indigenous set-aside and you subcontract work, a certain percentage of those subcontracts are supposed to be to Indigenous companies. Not all, of course, but a certain percentage. And yet across departments, we found that there was no tracking whatsoever of subcontracts. So the minister says that the purpose of this program is to verify Indigenous identity and then spectacularly fails to put systems in place to verify Indigenous identity. And I note that as part of it, that it seems that the qualification of an Indigenous business by this government doesn't line up with the way that Indigenous business organizations and communities are qualifying and defining Indigenous organizations. So I would like to hear from the witnesses what your reaction is to these revelations about an absence of verification of Indigenous businesses and what can be done to ensure that procurement that is supposed to be for Indigenous businesses is actually for real Indigenous businesses. Maybe we'll go to the chief online first, and then Mr. Ducharme here.
Thank you very much for the question. It's been an issue since the beginning of the program, as you know.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to hold on 2 seconds. We're barely hearing sound. We're going to turn it up on our end. Can you just give us a couple seconds? We think we can hear you better now.
Okay, how's that? Everything's good? Can you hear me well?
Better, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Please go ahead.
No. Thank you very much. Yes, it's very, very important. It's been an issue from the very beginning in regards to this strategy, where there have been token Indians. There's been, sorry to say, you could pick up somebody on the side of the street. If they're Indigenous, they become that token Indian, and there's no qualifications needed for that Indigenous person. So there's some work to be done in that aspect also, ensuring that the Aboriginal is, capable of having the ownership of this so-called business, if it is a shell company, and to make sure that they're there working day to day, and not just being given a couple of dollars on the side just for their name. So this is huge. And in reference to this, our status, we have a status card. Most First Nations, and I think every First Nation does have a status card. When it comes to the Métis, I'm not sure if there is regulations put in place as it is done in the First Nations, where our status is recognized in Canada. And I want to ensure that all the memberships of all of the organizations have something in place to ensure that they are whether Métis or Inuit or First Nations, that there is verification showing that, and not just walking in a door and say, I'm Métis because my great-grandfather was, has a descendant. So this is important to us, especially when we're looking at a percentage of 5% for the procurement, when we want to ensure that the First Nation organization does have adequate percentage of that 5% to ensure that we're not just giving 5% to another organization person whose membership has not been verified by INAC, or does it fall within the terms of that membership. So that's very, very important, and it's been an issue from the very beginning. And I'll give you a perfect example. I owned the brick furniture store back in at the time that the minister Bernard Baiku was the Minister of Indigenous Aboriginal Affairs, and I asked him, I want to sell my mattresses to the shipbuilding down here in Halifax, and I asked him about that because at that time it was 10% procurement, and he said, yeah, he said it is the law, but there's nobody pushing it. So that's a problem from the very beginning. You had this in place and there was nobody governing it or managing it to ensure that we did receive our 10%.
Just to quickly probe that in the time I have left, though, can I ask, I mean, why isn't there a lining up of the federal government's qualification with the qualifications that are coming from Indigenous communities? Why is there a dissonance between what they're calling an Indigenous business and what you're calling an Indigenous business?
Well, it's because there's no verification. I mean, at the end of the day, they seem to think that if you walk in the door, you cannot ask if a proof of Indigenous. And that's where the problem lies. When anybody can walk in the door and say, I'm Inuit, I'm Métis, or I'm First Nations, without any verification. And as you know, First Nations communities and band members have received their status from Ottawa. Worship on the other Indigenous organizations, I'm not sure how that's working, but that's questionable to me as a First Nations person. And I just want to ensure that we are doing this in a correct way and stop going behind closed doors and coming out with documents to say this is what we have as a policy, now tweak it. You wasted time and money, as I mentioned earlier. We need to be at the forefront of this discussion, and because we know where the needs are within these policies. So please take that into consideration before moving forward. Again, going behind closed doors and saying, well, we heard from them, and this is what we come up with. That's got to stop. They've done it for years and years and years, and it's got to stop. It's wasting government money as well as your time and my time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Ducharme. Maybe we can get to you the next intervention. Mr. Métis, please go ahead.
Do you think that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit should all have a distinct way of determining who they are, that they tell the government on how to do this, instead of basically the government trying to find one box to lump everyone into Indigenous and say, check this box and show the determination, when you have a various way across not just this country, but across the world of determining indigeneity?
There should be. I think for First Nations, the one that are losing their status after 2 generations, as Chief Bernard said, that the community, they're band members, they don't have the status. Mm-hmm. But I think that should be allowed because, I mean, just because you've buried outside of being Indigenous, that still makes you Indigenous. So I think Indigenous people are the ones that are best to determine who's an Indigenous person.
But I guess the question is, instead of just saying Indigenous in a blanket way, should we make it distinctions-based, where we have the First Nations determining who's a First Nation, the Métis determining who's a Métis, and the Inuit determining who's an Inuit, instead of trying to lump them all into one box?
If you're going to distinguish between the 3 Indigenous groups, yes.
Do you think that would be helpful?
It would be helpful, but it could also cause challenges, I think. I think it seems as though we're being separated. We've always been separated as Indigenous peoples. I have cousins that are First Nation members that I consider brothers or sisters, but I'm Métis, and I feel that we're always trying to be separated. It feels like people are nervous if we came together, we'd be stronger as a collective.
I think that's one way of defining it, but if there's different criteria for different folks, don't you feel that it should be within those communities to determine themselves instead of trying to make one program work for everyone? Because as you said, there's no cutoff date for anyone involved in Métis and Manitoba who's related to script. But you've just heard from Regional Chief Bernard that after 2 generations, the Indian Act ensures that there's a cutoff date. So how can you be fair to both and say, here's what we're going to put on the table for everyone when we know that one only can just pass their genes down for 2 generations and one can do it in perpetuity.
Well, I think what I did agree to Chief Bernard was saying that they do recognize them as a band member. I'm saying that they're not just because the government with the 2-generation cutoff makes them not status. They are still Indigenous in my view. And I think that was the community that has decided they're a member and they're part of the community. With the Métis, you have to be recognized by a community as being a member of that community as well.
So short question, Joanna, do you think it should be distinctions-based? The First Nation determine the First Nations, the Métis determine the Métis, and the Inuit determine the Inuit, instead of having a box approach to indigeneity?
I do believe there's a problem there, as we only have a 5% procurement strategy. And if you look at the membership, over almost 1 million First Nations people across Canada, and then the Indigenous, the other national organizations, what are their population? And their population list, or their membership list, is, to me, not really valid when we can't add 2nd generation and more where they can. So the validity of the membership from Métis is questionable in my opinion. There should be something where across the board where it is verified, not just saying, well, my great-great-grandfather or grandmother is Indigenous, so that makes me Métis, and then become a member. And my concern with the 5% is when you're looking at the AFN with the huge population compared to the other 2 smaller organizations, where is that going to be fair for the procurement strategy, making sure that Indigenous First Nations and peoples are getting a chunk of that 5%, because I worry that the procurement will allow a Métis or First Nations to take it all. Or the majority of it. And that's where we need to ensure that we're not being cut off because the 5% is reached. So now First Nations, communities or businesses, actually it's not communities, it's businesses. It has nothing to do with the community. We could talk about that at another time because there should be benefits to the community. But like I said, it's just not working, Jamie.
Mr. Genuis, go ahead, please, sir.
Mr. Ducharme, just very directly building off the round of questioning we just had, you have a list of Indigenous businesses. You work hard on it. You engage to make sure that list is accurate. It's reflective of very clear criteria. The federal government does not use your list. They have their own list, and we've seen various revelations about how flawed their processes are. I don't understand why the federal government wouldn't just engage with Indigenous leaders, Indigenous business organizations to say, can we use the list you're developing to identify Indigenous businesses for our own procurement policies? Is there any impediment that I'm missing to simply taking on this collaborative approach that would use the work that's already being done?
I think it would be a very simple process to have us recognized. And I do know with Defence Construction Canada, when they talk to Indigenous businesses or Corporate Canada for subcontract opportunities, they do talk about the CCIB Indigenous Business List. Unfortunately, right now it's not recognized. They still have to be within the Indigenous Business Directory. But we have been advocating because, again, we are very confident the businesses that we do have are Indigenous businesses. Corporate Canada leans on our list for their Indigenous procurement.
Right, so the private sector is using your list. I'm hearing you saying there's no impediment, and I would just add this is so typical of the way the federal government often operates, is trying to replicate work that's already being done and doing it less well. I also want to follow up directly on Mr. Baptiste's questions. When it comes to Indigenous identity, I think we all understand that there are going to be some complex or marginal cases, but there are also some very clear-cut cases. As part of one of these investigations, a reporter was able to get certification, so-called, through an online attestation. Now, I believe that Indigenous identity is something real. It's not how you feel. It's not something that someone like me can just decide they want and claim it. It's something that is real and objective. Now, in that context, I note that a couple members of Parliament, both themselves Indigenous, have used the word pretendian or pretendianism to describe this phenomenon of people kind of outright pretending to be Indigenous in order to benefit. So I want to ask you kind of a multi-part question about that. The first is just on language. Do you think this terminology is appropriate? Is this terminology we should be using or not? Secondly, my understanding is that concerns about this falsification of identity are broader than just procurement, that we see other instances, in fact, where this pretending to be Indigenous is causing problems, and what can we do about it? And then just thirdly, would you agree with what I said at the beginning, that Indigenous identity is something objective? It's not a subjective question of how you feel. It's an objective, verifiable reality. So for this, maybe we'll start with Chief Bernard, and then hopefully there'll be some time for Mr. Ducharme.
Yeah, it's an issue definitely in regards to the verification of the status. I mean, or the validity of the Indigenous aspect of any individual, and it's just not right that it's different for each of the three different organizations. There needs to be some consistency in those three when we're verifying who is Indigenous and who is not. Because as mentioned before, I could see your name there, Genuous? I can't see it. Okay, anyways, I see it a little bit there. Just to say that it needs to have some consistency. As First Nations status goes, it's cut off at the second generation, whereas the other issues and the validity of indigenousy is it's a free-for-all. As mentioned before, you just pop up a bunny picture and you're Indigenous, which I don't understand how that ever happened. And if that person happens to be on one of the lists of the national organizations. And again, I do question the validity of those memberships. If there's a First Nations person who falsely received their status, they are revoked. When they are brought to the forefront, the federal government has taken back those status from those individuals who falsely claimed. So it would be the same for all of the three organizations.
And to get Mr. Ducharme, because I cut him off last time, so.
And real quick, because I'm going to end up cutting you off.
Unfortunately, when you said terminology, I kind of lost what you were requesting, asking. But I think
just the word pretendian that some members.
Pretendian is something that it's just very. I'm in my 50s. I've been around a long time. I've faced a lot of discrimination. When I first started hearing people pretending or trying to be Indigenous, I took them at face value. Why would someone want to be Indigenous with all the issues that we had in the prairies to be Indigenous? I mean, if I could have hit it, I would have hit it, but I couldn't hit it. I was physically visible as an Indigenous person. So the pretendian is something that's it's a very personal thing that, I mean, it's shocking that it's happening, and it's sad, but again, sometimes it is. People are taking advantage of it, but anything, people try and take advantage. You're always going to find unscrupulous people that take advantage of being Indigenous.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines.
It was discussed earlier about the directory, and you said CCIB has its own, and the government has its own. How are there commonalities between these lists, or how different are they? And are you aware of the differences between these lists?
Well, again, I don't know the process that the government uses. I mean, when you go online and look at the government process to be registered as an Indigenous business, it does say you have to include the proof of indigeneity, you have to include the documentation to show it. I mean, that would be very similar. We followed a bit of the guidelines to look at that. We also looked at the U.S., where supplier diversity is sort of a component of that. It's been happening since 1968. So the documentation to prove the 51%. I mean, the government list, I'm not in the back end of the government, so I don't do their certification. I'm quite confident with what we do for certification, and it was something that our corporate members also wanted to ensure. We did a survey in 2016, and 72% of them wanted to ensure that if they were working with Indigenous businesses, that it was a bona fide Indigenous business and not someone claiming indigeneity just to take advantage of a programming.
I've seen representatives of this federal government get up in the House and say that Indigenous procurement is solely about the individuals receiving the contracts. It isn't about community. Is this a gap? Is this something that your organization has brought up with the government as a shortcoming? I just notice quite a stark contrast between the comments of the government and the comments that you made before the committee just a moment ago.
Well, First Nations are government. They're not in the business of doing business. They are not entrepreneurs. They are government. They do need help and in-house resources as much as they can. We're not the only department that is not funded sufficiently, as you know, like education across the board is not sufficient, like anything else. So the only way for us to get ahead of that is to have some in-house resources and revenues. And one way to do that is to look at the local economy, looking to, set up a scholarship to help our students get to school, or to help build a park, or help build a health center. These are the things that benefits could go to the community. So there is a difference between Indigenous entrepreneurs who are not government, and you don't want the government to be involved in this. I mean, if for some reason I'm an entrepreneur and I don't like the chief and the chief don't like me, I get nothing, which is why they never worked for fisheries and it never worked for forestry. They gave the allocations to the community, and then the chief and council made these decisions who had no background in fisheries or forestry. So this comes back full circle here. That's where we are today, and we need to look at ways that we can benefit the communities through Aboriginal benefits, which would it be a percentage to help scholarships or anything within that region where that work is being done. Thank you.
Thanks. So thanks very much.
My first question can go to either one of you. In August of 2021, the government made its target of having each department award at least 5% of their total contract value to Indigenous-owned businesses mandatory. So it's my understanding that before 2021, there was a target, but it wasn't mandatory. Can either of you comment on the level of Indigenous participation in federal contracting prior to this target being made mandatory?
Well, I think if you looked at the numbers are quite a bit lower, that they weren't there. I think it was showing maybe around 1% of it. I think it was first announced in 2019, where I think it was part of the mandate letter to look at setting a target of 5%. And that was when we first started talking about the 5% Indigenous procurement target. It is still difficult for a lot of businesses with the federal government and federal procurement. I think it needs to be simplified. I think they need to look at some of the levels of requirements for their contracts. A $150,000 or $100,000 contract requires the same amount of work as a $10 or $20 million. Small Indigenous businesses and all smaller businesses in Canada don't have the resources to do that. So I think there is still some struggles, but some of these other big ones, like when we look at the reporting from 2023, where it was on paper it's 6.27% of the value went to Indigenous businesses, but in reality we did not get that.
Thank you very much. And that's a great segue into my next question. As you noted, it was reported that the value of government contracts awarded under the program has risen sharply to $862 million in the 2022 fiscal year, which is up from $170 million in the 5 years prior. And according to the 2022-2023 ISC report on the mandatory minimum 5% target, it was reported that 6.27% of all contracts were awarded to Indigenous businesses. And on the face of it, that would appear like the government has already exceeded the targets that they set for 24-25. However, as we all know, the devil is often in the detail, which is why our committee undertook this study. From bombshell reports over the summer, we know that this government has done little to no vetting of businesses to ensure they qualify as Indigenous businesses, and my colleague has done a great job in digging into that. But, when we were passing this motion to study this program, we were told by government members that we didn't understand what the purpose of this program was all about, and that it was running just fine and accomplishing the purpose for which it was created. Are you concerned at all that the current government sees no issues with the abuse that has been uncovered, particularly the so-called rent-a-feather scheme, or the lack of concern about verifying the Indigenous identity of businesses before giving them access to the program? And I'll turn to Chief Chief Bernard.
Thank you. I do want to note that those numbers have not been verified. The research that you did shows that it went to an Indigenous company, but if you look deeper, you will find that that is not true when you go into each individual contract and who was part of it. Was it a shell company? Even though in your reporting it shows that it's Indigenous, it may not have been. So in reality, that so-called 6% is probably down more like 1%. I just don't understand. At one point it was 10% when the first Aboriginal procurement strategy came out. It was 10%. There was no governing of it. Nothing was done to enforce it, as mentioned. And then in 2019, according to what I just heard, that they've been starting to try to enforce it, but yet they're not looking into the details. As we know, the devil is in the details to verify actually how much that Indigenous company or person or entrepreneur received, because the majority of them, I hate to say this, is they are shell companies, and so it's important to really go deeper to see where that percentage is at. And to me, it would probably be more down in the 1%. But I'm not understanding here that the government is now wanting to give 5%, but couldn't even manage the 10%. So what's going to be different now? Anyways, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Back to you, Mr. Métis.
Mr. Ducharme, I was really interested in the discussion you had about the uploading of the picture. Now, I know many communities, many First Nations across Canada also have corporate divisions within their communities. I know that in Eskasoni, the community that I'm from, has an eagle that represents their corporate. I've seen others in the West use buffaloes. In British Columbia, they use the orcas. Is it possible that this narrative that the media and the Conservatives has spun about a bunny being used to verify verification was actually the government just asking for a picture that representative of their community?
I don't know if it was representative of their community, but again, I have been to places where I've been told, like even some online platforms where they say just upload a blank document or something because the system requires something to be put in.
Yes.
Again, I'm just speculating, but when I look at it from the business, it was reported that it was a community-owned business. Well, a community isn't going to have a status card on its own, so maybe that could have been why it was determined that just upload a picture. And to bypass the system so that you can actually go through the certification process. And again, I'm speculating. I did not do the certification.
Okay. Regional Chief Bernard, do you believe that it's important to have a percentage of the procurement going to Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, Inuit and Métis, and do you see this as something that's valued in terms of the efforts made to decrease the gap of Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada?
I definitely do think that it's essential to help, the communities and poverty within the communities. Because if there's a community entrepreneur that is making money, his money is being spent within his community. So it does benefit the community a bit. And in regards to the tribal councils, they are owned by the First Nations. So the First Nation has a band number. So to so-called rabbit pictures, it doesn't make sense. You just show that you are from that community and what that community band number is, and it's registered in Canada. Each community is registered with the number, so that would be the way to do it, and not just as a tribal council because they don't have an individual band member. So there's ways about that this can be done efficiently and properly to ensure that the word tribal council, anybody could use it. So to me, I'm assuming that a tribal council is consisting of multiple, maybe at least 3 First Nations, and in doing so, they can use their band numbers for that community instead of a status number.
And Regional Chief, I share with you the concerns around the Indian Act and the cutoff. I know that we've had conversations of this. I've had conversations with the National Chief. When we passed Bill C-15 on UNDRIP, it actually has a clause under Article 33 in UNDRIP that says Indigenous people have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. This does not impair the right of Indigenous individuals to obtain citizenships of the states which they live. And so if C-15 has now received royal assent and United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People is the law, and we believe in Canada that this is the law, has AFN tabled any kind of resolutions in which they could assist the government in determining a better system for us to determine status as a moving forward?
As you know, there are a lot of resolutions that are being passed in reference to this. And all I have to say is stop doing the work behind closed doors. Bring us to the table. Work with us. We will help you to have a better understanding and how to get these policies and even legislation changed. But we need to be there with you. We need to work from the very beginning of the issue, not like after, all these years go by and time is wasted, money is wasted, and then say, well, how can we do to fix it? Just bring us in from the beginning. And I think that should help in reference to the getting this right finally.
Thank you, Joe. Regional Chief, I just wanted to. Isn't that the process that the minister is currently undertaking with AFN? I know she's working with the Youth Council, the AFN, in a consultation process that opened up in December to explore ways around the second generation cutoff.
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt
yes or no
just very briefly. Do you mind moving your mic down about? Perfect. Thanks very much. And we're not out of time. You have about 25 seconds to respond, please.
Okay. Well, I just want to say there should be a cutoff for other organizations. If you're going to do it with the First Nations cutoff, then you must do it with the other organizations. And if you don't, then stop the cutoff after second generation. Let us decide who are the people living in our communities. Because as you know, if you're living in the community and you are not status, you don't get funding for it, but we put them as members in our communities because we take care of our families. And there's no way in heck that we could tell the Prime Minister that his grandchild is not his blood. So come on, we got to fix this, and that's another subject. You know as well as I do.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And just if you could, I'm out of time here, but if AFN has any reports or resolutions that they could table to help this committee determine what they feel is the best way to determine First Nation identity, I think that would be very helpful. And I think that before the end of this committee, that document would be really well received by this committee.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kusi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Ducharme and Chief Bernard, for being here with us today. I just want to go back to some previous testimony of yours, Mr. Ducharme, in 2018, prior to the August 6, 2021 announcement, to sort of measure what you said, what you suggested, I should say, versus what the government produced. So in 2018, when OGGO previously studied this issue, your organization sent in a brief that stated the federal government should award points to bidders based on their relationships with Indigenous businesses and communities to ensure that there is Indigenous engagement throughout their supply chain. Is this a recommendation that was accepted and acted upon by this government, in your opinion?
I'm sorry, don't quite understand. Was that from corporations that would have to ensure that they had Indigenous inclusion within their opportunity? Yes, that in
going through a procurement process,
yes,
that more points should be awarded to those bidders who have relationships with Indigenous businesses and communities, so not solely on the basis of being recognized as Indigenous through the self-proclamation or officially as the processes we have heard throughout the testimony of this committee, but through the relationships. Do you believe that do you still believe that's important, and do you believe that this recommendation was incorporated into the process?
It has been implemented into some of the process, and I think that's within the Indigenous participation plans. A lot of the government, there is no standard procedure right now or threshold for that, but some of the bigger contracts, there is an Indigenous participation plan that's included within it, and within that participation plan, they talk about community investment, they talk about employment, subcontracting opportunities, and they are awarded points for that. The evaluation of that has to happen with all of them. I know the federal government, and again, there should be a threshold. It shouldn't be just at the discretion of the contracting authority as to whether or not to include an Indigenous participation plan. I think that's very valuable because, again, that does give the smaller ones. And it is also, as when the Chief Bernard was talking about the community investment, within these participation plans, they will go into the community. They might help with building a school, building a park. It is happening more. There is seeing it more. That's why some of our corporate members are also hoping that the federal government would recognize our certified Indigenous businesses, because they are working with those businesses, and that could be included within their Indigenous participation plan results.
Thank you for that. However, in the 2018 study, government officials also testified that they encouraged Indigenous businesses to enter joint ventures with non-Indigenous businesses to bid on contracts. In your opinion, should this practice be encouraged, or should the focus be entirely on improving socioeconomic outcomes for First Nations? I shouldn't say entirely, it should be entirely based on that, but should that be done through the not encouraging Indigenous businesses to enter joint ventures with non-Indigenous businesses?
Well, I think joint ventures do have a place, and they are required, because if the smaller Indigenous business, a lot of it could also even be with the insurance requirements, with the bid bonding, that the Indigenous business does not have the capacity to be able to do that. The non-Indigenous business of joint ventures is there to help the Indigenous business grow. There should be a shelf life for a joint venture. I mean, there's been times where a joint venture has been going on 20 years. If it's a true joint venture, that non-Indigenous partner should have helped that Indigenous partner be able to become their own prime contractor themselves. So joint ventures are important, but they have to be looked at and ensure that the benefit is going at the risk growth to the Indigenous businesses. It can't be something that's always going to be able to bid on these contracts and be getting contracts for 20 years because of a JV, and there has been no growth for the Indigenous partner.
In our evaluation of the ArriveCan scandal, we found that there were significant faults in the subcontracting processes. So in your opinion, should there be an overview of the subcontracting process to ensure Indigenous involvement throughout the supply chain?
There is, and that's where I've been saying earlier that there should be a pre-award, post-contract audit done to ensure that what has been claimed to be benefiting Indigenous businesses is happening for those ArriveCan contracts. Again, I'm not privy to them. I don't know what it is. I just see what the media, and again, media or what is reported needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But if they actually looked at that, and if there was a value to say, okay, well, within that ArriveCan, that went towards the PSIB or the amount of Indigenous procurement, I don't understand. I don't know if any of that value went to the procurement strategy for Indigenous business as part of Indigenous spend.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Kusamirchuk, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ducharme, for being here today. Before I became a member of Parliament, I worked for a regional innovation center, We Tech Alliance, and we helped establish a program. We worked with First Nations, Indigenous partners to establish a program called Supporting Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurs in Windsor, Essex, SAYWE. Fantastic program, and it's through that program that I got a chance to also learn about the incredible work of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, the CCIB. Wonderful organization, great work. And I also learned that the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs in Canada are Indigenous businesses. And there was one particular young entrepreneur who started a company called Culture Shock, selling jewelry and apparel. And I can tell you the immense pride we all felt when that entrepreneur opened up a bricks and mortar storefront in Windsor several years ago to great success. It was wonderful to be part of that. How important is it? You mentioned, you yourself in your opening statement mentioned a successful company that was very successful through its procurement, through this procurement process, federal procurement process. How important is it, in your opinion, to share the success stories of Indigenous businesses working through the federal procurement program? How important is it to get those good stories out?
Thank you, and thank you for the compliments for CCIB. I would also like to recognize that our president and CEO, Tabitha Bull, is actually sitting right behind me. She should have been up here, and I think a lot of our success has been as a result of the great leadership that she's brought forward to CCIB. But I think, again, what we need to do, and as Indigenous people, quite often, we don't want to brag about ourselves. It's hard for us to promote and brag. And I think we at CCIB need to be doing that. We need to showcase, because, again, when you see the success and when you see the growth and what Indigenous businesses have done, people, it's a little bit frustrating sometimes. Oh, I worked with an Indigenous business and they did that. Well, why do you think we can't do that? but unfortunately, that is sort of the perception. Again, so much media, and whenever Indigenous are involved, it's negative, just like with an Indigenous procurement. A lot of these things where people have taken advantage of it are showcasing. That gets the bites. That's what people look at. I think we should always be celebrating. We do that through our award systems at CCIB. I've had some of the great friends. I mean, Chief Bernard was talking about John Bernard. I was working with John in the 1990s, and I mean, he's been one of our Indigenous leaders. He's actually won a Lifetime Achievement Award through CCIB for entrepreneurship. And again, I think it's so uplifting for our young people to see someone that looks like them succeeding, going in, having a nice car, having a nice house, and sharing, giving them opportunities. So anytime, we should focus a lot more on success as opposed to failure. And I think Indigenous procurement is a means of success. As I said, like even when you look at the Boucher Group, it's a privately held company. They gave $1 million away to charities this year. They employ 40% Indigenous people from 80 communities around the country. We can take care of ourselves. You know, if all of a sudden you decide to drop this, well, bad on you, but we are still going to succeed. As Indigenous people, we've been knocked down and opportunities taken away from us for so often, but we are resilient, and we're going to keep going. And I think we do need to showcase our success. There's incredible businesses. I am so proud. I think I'm one of the luckiest people. I travel across the country working with Indigenous businesses. We have roundtables talking about this and the innovation. I mean, if you look at the defense sector, there are so many new, upcoming, innovative, that provides so many great things. We are hosting an Indigenous procurement event in Edmonton on October 16th. We have 4 certified Indigenous businesses that are going to be showcasing the innovation they bring. Some of the stuff they bring is actually going to help corporate Canada. They can sell some carbon capture points. I don't know what all that is, but again, the innovation that Indigenous businesses are bringing is incredible. We're going to showcase that. We're going to showcase also our Aboriginal procurement champions that are doing a lot to help Indigenous businesses. We're also going to be talking about government procurement. So again, we'd welcome anyone to join, and it's going to be a great event. We just need to promote and showcase that we are successful, and there's a lot to be proud of.
And I would love to have a conversation with you about how we can, including ourselves here, the media, spotlight those tremendous, uplifting, positive stories about tremendous Indigenous businesses and success stories. Would love to work with you on that. But I understand the work of this committee wanting to strengthen the program. And I just wanted to quote the minister here, Minister Haidu, who stated, quote, "We're working with Indigenous partners to think through a better way, perhaps even at some point turning over maintenance of the list to Indigenous partners." So I just wanted to get on the record. We are working with First Nations, Métis, Inuit, with our Indigenous partners to make sure that we are improving this program so that it serves our entire Canadian community and Indigenous partners. Thank you.
You compared the federal government's approach to their directory, which is solely about proving indigeneity, to your organization's more comprehensive approach, which includes not only Indigenous identity, but also other factors. Is this a fair characterization?
Well, I think if you go on the Indigenous Business Directory, I think to be included on the Indigenous Business Directory, it does ask that you have to supply more than just proof of indigeneity. You do have to supply the documentation to prove the ownership and control meets the 51% criteria for to be classified as an Indigenous business. Maybe you just attest to that without actually providing the documentation. I don't know. I don't do the certification for the federal government, but we do.
Okay,
but
my question was just about the distinction or the difference between your organization's directory and Indigenous Services Canada's list. Whether it sounded like your organization was utilizing a more comprehensive approach to certifying Indigenous business than that of the federal government. Perhaps I'm wrong. That was my impression just based on previous remarks.
Well, I think if you actually went into the Indigenous Business Directory and look at the requirement for being included, I think that documentation is required. It's not just to say you're Indigenous, because you still have to prove that there's an actual business, that you're the owner of that business. So there is documentation. And that's what we require as well, to have the 51% ownership and control be held by the Indigenous individual or individuals.
If I may, to both of our witnesses, we have the ability to make recommendations to the federal government to improve this Indigenous procurement process and program. If you could make one recommendation to the government that would improve the current approach, what would it be? And maybe starting with Mr. Ducharme, and then we'll go to Chief Bernard.
Just brief, because we're almost out of time.
Again, I think the one recommendation is to work with Indigenous peoples and the businesses and give them the opportunities and see what the challenges are from Indigenous businesses to be able to do it. I mean, you have to simplify the process as well, I think, for the federal government with their contracting requirements.
Since the first meeting in December of 2023, the FNPO, which is the First Nations Procurement Organization, has formed a steering committee of 6 Indigenous organizations, including AFN. I'm looking to secure some funding to ensure the work that is being done there, alongside with the Canadian government, to be part of this, so that they can get full-blown information right from the organizations on how to make this a better process. I do want to, can I say one thing? Being Aboriginal, it's not a skill, but yet an Aboriginal procurement with joint ventures, it's almost like that. If you're Aboriginal, then all of a sudden that's a qualification for bringing to a joint venture. And we don't agree with this. Obviously, you have to start somewhere. That should be small, but we believe that the Aboriginal side of the joint venture should progress, and it doesn't seem to be doing that. We do joint ventures, but there's no initiative for the First Nation portion of that joint venture to grow. So there's some work to be done there, as well as everything else that was discussed today. So I'm really looking to see if we can get the secured funding to move forward and work with the Canadian government on this strategy. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can you give that acronym again? What does that mean, the FNPO? Okay, I know she really talked about the 5 organizations that are working.
Yes, the 6 organizations, Indigenous organizations, including AFN. It's the First Nations Procurement Organization. That our very first meeting was December 2023, where we've all come together looking for ways to strengthen the strategy and so we can all be satisfied with moving forward. And if there's a need for changes, let's look at that and work together. I just can't stand the fact that the government does this. They go behind closed doors. They think they know how the best way to serve us when we're not even at the table. That's got to stop. And I've said this to the Prime Minister himself when I was National Chief. And it's not only on this issue, it's on everything across the board. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for your testimony. As my colleague mentioned, this is part of a much bigger study on a broken procurement system under this Liberal government. And one of the issues that we have found in procurement across government is the use of middlemen, companies which subcontract all of the work, doing none of it themselves, but taking a 15 to 30% cut of any project. And I guess my question to both of you would be, do you support the Auditor General launching an audit into fraud in Indigenous procurement?
I do.
Yes, if there's just cause for them to investigate, I think it's very relevant, and I think that would probably dissuade others if there's repercussions for it.
Thank you very much. I will now turn the rest of my time over to Ms. Kusi.
Thank you very much. In my previous line of questioning, I was talking about the subcontracting, but I'm also interested in the business structure which is most beneficial. In your opinion, Mr. Ducharme, should the government seek Indigenous involvement throughout the business structure and not just the ownership to ensure that it is truly Indigenous people that receive the benefits of the set-aside?
Are you talking employees within the organization, or when you say the structure, I'm not sure what you're
been a focus on the ownership as opposed to the employees. And in my opinion, this would be a benefit of doing an overview of the subcontracting process and the structure within the process. But just to get your opinion as well, do you think that the government should seek Indigenous involvement throughout the business structure and not just the ownership itself?
Well, again, I think then we're going to be held to different standards than other people. I think as Indigenous people, we in turn are going to hire our own people, and our stats do show that that's what's happening. Indigenous businesses hire Indigenous people, but a woman-owned business or a minority-owned business does not have that requirement. That was a requirement that was always done. I feel that as Indigenous people, we're always held to a higher standard than other groups within Canada, and I find that it's almost offensive and racist in ways that we have to prove more. We have to be different than any other group, that more is expected of us and more burden on us to be able to succeed and grow our businesses.
In regards to that question, if I may,
Yes, please
it
do.
was mentioned that the First Nations, the organizations or the businesses, Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses have to hire so many Indigenous people. That could be to the demise of any organization or business. John Bernard from Donnacona had an issue with this back in 2006 when he spoke to the Standing Committee. The problem lies with that is, if there's no qualified people to do that work, or Indigenous people, then we are cut off. And that is to the demise. And no Indigenous company or non-Native company would hire people for the sake of just hiring them because they're Indigenous or not. It could be to the demise of that company. So in insisting a percentage of Indigenous people being hired, I don't think that should be really implemented in here. We always try our best as Indigenous companies to hire Indigenous people, but if we can't, then we are cut off from the bidding process, and that's just not correct. So there's definitely more work to be talked about, to be done there. So I do agree with the other speaker that it needs, or the other witness, that it shouldn't be an issue, but the ownership at 51 plus should definitely be, and to prove that they are the owner and they are getting those benefits. It's important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you. Chief Bernard, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ducharme. Chief Bernard, you mentioned earlier that 5%, that if the Métis Nation or members of the Métis community were to receive up to 5% of the contracts, then there would be no room left for the AFN. Now, is that correct, or is this not that's a floor? It's not a ceiling, right? There's opportunity to continue on with contracts with those that are identified. Is that not correct?
Absolutely, that is true. But if you look around the table, you can probably look at everybody around that table right now, say that they have Aboriginal ancestry. They may even
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Can you move your mic back down?
I can't hear you.
Or up? Just. We can't hear you at all right now.
Well,
can you hear me now?
Perfect. And you start again, please.
Yes. So I do want, if you don't mind, if there could be a repeat of that question, I'm sorry.
Yes, certainly. You mentioned earlier that should the Métis community receive up to 5% of the contracts, then there would be nothing left for other identified Indigenous communities. Is that correct? Or is that not a floor as opposed to a ceiling?
Well, as you know, it is the floor. The minimum is 5%. So hopefully that we can get above that, and that's not the concern I have. The concern is the three national organizations, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. The population is different. So in taking 5% and dividing it among three nations that could access some of these.
So let me correct that. I mean, you again are suggesting that if those other two communities got 5%, there would be nothing left. That's incorrect. Is that not so? There's more that can be had for more if there's more opportunities.
Well, there's more that can be had. Absolutely, more can be had because, as you mentioned, it is not the ceiling. it is the floor for that 5%. We're hoping to go above that at the, eventually. And hopefully on a yearly basis, we get up to that 10% if potentially possible. But my concern is if the government sees that they're at that 5% and you have one or two businesses that make up for that whole 5%, then there's no obligation on the government's part to look at all the other smaller First Nations entrepreneurs who may be looking for.
Thank you. Mr. Descharmes, do you share that concern?
Again, I think it's the reporting. What I am concerned about is if there is a $500 million contract that's a joint venture. I mean, that's taken up a lot of spend. The 5% again is a floor, and I think it can go over to that. It's not 5% that is divided between the three groups. It's Indigenous, and again, we can exceed that 5% between all three groups.
The government and the ministry is undergoing a review of this very issue, and the very issue of identifying who's Indigenous and who is not, and determining through consultations with other groups how to proceed in an effective manner. Has your organization been contacted by the government on this issue, Mrs. Sharm?
We work a lot with the government on Indigenous procurement, and I think even the AFN, there's been a few different committees that we've sat on that we've talked about Indigenous procurement.
Chief Bernard, has your organization been contacted by government in trying to determine the best way forward on this issue?
No, this issue in reference to membership of the organization has been an issue from the beginning, and it's something that I haven't seen government take this seriously. As you know, everybody can have a descendant, up to 10 generations. That makes them Métis. It's just not fair when our organization under First Nations are all under the federal government where they tell us we're cut off after seconds. So where this is just, it's more work than ever, and it's not something new. So it definitely needs to be looked at.
Chief Bernard, I'm talking about the status of the Indigenous Business Directory. Have there been consultations with the organization to determine how best to proceed?
Not that I'm aware of.
So the review that's being underway now with other stakeholder groups, you have not been, not you specifically, but your organization has not been.
I'm assuming they have. If you're telling me that government is already undertaking this, then they must have reached out to AFN.
Mr. Deschamps, we have differences of opinion, obviously, here between various organizations to determine who's Indigenous and who's not. You've already identified that you and your directory that you've established alongside your business directory for those that are Indigenous. How well received are they in the community in terms of the private sector in determining those contracts?
Well, I think any of our Indigenous businesses are recognized by the private sector, and they are well received within procurement opportunities. And
what is your do you have consultations with AFN and the Inuit community as well in these determinations?
There are a lot of different consultation groups, and the AFN does sit on committees that we sit on when we talk about federal procurement and advancing the 5%. There is the Indigenous Procurement Working Group, which is made up of ITK, the MNC, the AFN, other national Indigenous economic organizations as well.
And so when we talk about bigger contracts and the partnerships with those that may not be Indigenous, especially with the subcontracting, is there not an over requirement to have about, I believe it's 33% overall in terms of Indigenous?
Well, I think the 33%. Oh, thank you.
Can you answer quickly?
Probably not.
Thanks, Mr. Sousa. Mr. Genuis, please.
Thank you, Chair. As this is our final round, I just want to underline our view that Indigenous peoples in Canada have struggled heroically against incredible odds, and so many Indigenous entrepreneurs are doing incredible work, supporting themselves, their families, and uplifting their communities. I can say from an Alberta perspective, we've seen this particularly in the oil and gas sector, and how many Indigenous peoples, businesses, entrepreneurs, communities are part of and benefiting from the development of our energy resources, but it stretches across all sectors, of course. Meanwhile, the federal government in the last 9 years has broken the procurement system. So we are here celebrating Indigenous successes and also holding the federal government accountable for failures of engagement, of consultation, of responsiveness, of verification that we've talked about and that we've heard about from the witnesses. I have one question for each of you. Mr. Ducharme, one of the things I see in the procurement system in general is a favoritism for insiders, for incumbent players. And the Procurement Ombudsman has written about this, for instance, in the context of ArriveCam, where you have a whole bunch of criteria put in place that say you must have a certain number of existing contracts or existing work with the federal government. Now, an obvious effect of that, it seems to me, is that it excludes new businesses and people from historically disadvantaged backgrounds who are starting businesses, don't have perhaps the same kind of institutional history, are excluded by those kinds of rules. So you have, on the one hand, policies that are supposed to promote Indigenous procurement, but you have other policies which, in effect, make it more difficult for especially newer Indigenous businesses, as well as probably other minority-owned businesses, to access those opportunities. So would one way of improving the system also be to simply remove a lot of these kind of insider preferences that exist in the system so that new entrants have an easier time bidding on federal government opportunities?
Of course. I mean, I think making it easier for our Indigenous businesses, having that previous work experience has been one of the biggest struggles. I mean, if the government wanted to include Indigenous businesses and they didn't have it, and they require them to have previous experience with the government, well, they're not going to get those. So that is one area that we've been lobbying and advocating for as well. Like even with joint ventures, right now the non-Indigenous partner can provide all three references. We would like to see maybe the Indigenous partner have a smaller reference requirement, but then to ensure that it's making it easier. And again, there is a lot of people that want to keep using their same incumbent, but we have to look at to make sure that every opportunity should be reviewed to see if there is Indigenous capacity and invite Indigenous businesses to
So
that.
just to probe that a bit, actually, it sounds like what you're saying is that the combination of these Indigenous procurement policies, but also with kind of the preference for insiders, is pushing Indigenous businesses towards joint ventures, perhaps in cases where the Indigenous companies might be able to do the work themselves if there was a lower requirement on references. Is that true? I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to
I guess in a way it could be, but again, also lowering the requirements, because again, the bid bonding, like some of these requirements with the bid bonding and the insurance,
Right.
makes it impossible for our Indigenous businesses, and for them to be able to do it, they do need to have partners.
Right, yeah. The key thing should be whether or not the company can do the work, right?
Yes.
And to Chief Bernard, my expectation would be that the end objective of this policy is to improve economic opportunity for Indigenous communities and for Indigenous peoples in general across the country to be able to benefit. The means for getting to that objective, of course, is to support Indigenous entrepreneurs, but with the ultimate goal of general uplift for Indigenous peoples and to move towards substantive economic equality of opportunity. But Minister Haidu and David Yeo in his comments as well have essentially said it's just about the individual. It's about verification of the individual and the individual benefiting. As we've talked about, they haven't even done a very good job of providing that verification. But if this policy is working right, would we expect there to be a general uplift of Indigenous communities? And how can we track to ensure that this policy leads to that general uplift?
Thank you for the question. Well, right now, yes, I feel that there should be an uplifting here of the communities through the community members who are the entrepreneurs. Now, if you're Métis, you may not be associated with the First Nation, so there's no potential there, depending on where you live, because a lot of the Métis are not associated with First Nations, so they're not associated with those communities. They just happen to be descendants. So there lies the issue there. But definitely, if the entrepreneur is from a First Nation, there should be some uplifting of the community as well as the entrepreneur eventually. And so the validation of that database on how many Indigenous communities there are in Canada, we are easy for us to, for the AFN, because we are associated with First Nations and our membership list is in Ottawa, that they approved. Whereas if you're looking for the status of a Métis, they were just walked into the office and said they were Métis and showed something that they were 10th generation, and they became Métis, and they are now considered Aboriginal businesses, and that's where I have the problem.
Perfect. I have to cut you off there because we're out of time, Chief Bernard. We're going to go to Mr. Batiste, and then we'll finish with Mrs. Vignola and Mr. Backrack. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you. And Regional Chief, just, I think that you have done a great job of showing the complexity and the general inequalities that are out there when we look at trying to determine who is Indigenous. And this committee is tasked with trying to figure out how do we improve Indigenous procurement. But at the end of the day, it falls back on who is applying. The Conservatives believe that this is a simple process where we should have a simple solution. But across Canada, whether it's academia, whether it's business, whether it's the music industry, there are those who've benefited unfairly because of the question of who is Indigenous and who is determining who is Indigenous. You mentioned that you have a committee, FNPO, that is looking at this. Do you have best practices or a working document that you'd be able to share with this committee on what your views are on how to determine indigeneity in a fair way? And go further to that, if you don't, do you know of anyone across this country who's done this in a way that's helpful for government to figure out this question of how do we, as a primarily non-Indigenous entity, determine for Indigenous people who and who isn't part of them?
Well, I believe the First Nation Procurement Organization, the FNPO that I mentioned, is just started. So there may be something that was discussed within the last 6 months since the initial meeting. And if there is, I definitely can get it to you. I don't see that as a problem. But definitely the support of this organization with the other 6 Indigenous organizations is important. So I just really want to put that out to the committee members, to the Senate Standing Committees here. So it's essential to get the work done, and you need, in order to get it done fast enough and cheap, less costly, is to involve us. So definitely moving forward, we should be able to get something from the FNPO as long as we have the funding to continue. But I'm not sure where that lies. But definitely, this is a request from the AFN to establish some funds to be able to move forward and let us do the work with you. Thank you.
So, Regional Chief, just in terms of following up on that, I'm glad to hear that there's an organization tasked working collaboratively with different levels of organizations to address this topic. Can you tell us more about the FNPO and if you're someone sitting in a reserve in Eskasoni in my community and you say, who is this organization and why did we give them the mandate to determine who's Indigenous for the rest of us? How do we have confidence that this organization has the mandate to do such things?
Well, I don't know at this point in time. I was not part of that very first meeting in December in 2023. And so it's just initially starting. And the players around the table, I don't have that list or anything at this point, but in moving forward, definitely this organization should be the one working with the government to ensure that we are looking and ensuring that it is Indigenous entrepreneurs that are participating.
Take it from the chair that this organization that's doing this ongoing work would be given the opportunity to submit a document that might help improve the study?
You're more than welcome to submit it.
Okay. Is there any final comments that either of you have on how we can improve this process? Joanne, I heard a good bit from you, but I wanted to give Mr. Ducharme a chance to weigh in and final thoughts.
Well, I think at CCIB we are ready and we have our feet on the ground doing all of this work already. I think a lot of the things, when you look at this, we're talking Indigenous business. There's almost two different sidelines here. You're determining who's Indigenous, and then you're also in turn determining what an Indigenous business is. I think the indigeneity is something that, even within the FNPO, my understanding is, again, each one of the First Nations would still have to determine who their membership is, and I don't know if the FNPO as a whole would be respected across the country. I mean, we have 630 some First Nations that have their own rules and regulations and who they have on their membership, and even some of the stuff that Chief Bernard mentioned today about who they keep on as members, even though if the government, and again, a lot of that with the government, I think, is a result of funding and costs associated with it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again to both of our witnesses for their part in this important conversation. Indigenous Services Canada does have a procedure in place for pre-award compliance audits, and I'm curious, Mr. Ducharme, whether any of the businesses that are members of your organization have been subject to such pre-award compliance audits, and if so, what their experience of that audit process has been.
In the past, we have had a couple of businesses that have been audited, and they did say it was a very thorough process that they went through. Again, there used to be a trigger, I think, on a value of contracts that they said there would be audits, but I don't know if that's ever been completely followed through on.
Yeah, I believe the trigger is value of $2 billion. Those audits are required, and there's some discretion to perform audits in other cases as well. I guess the question is whether you feel that audit process is sufficiently robust to ensure the integrity of the overall process, or whether there are improvements needed when it comes to audits.
Well, I think that audit process should have almost done it the original part to be able to allow them to actually be included in the directory to ensure that they meet their criteria.
So more comprehensive and applied in more cases prior to even being considered, as opposed to right before a contract award?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Chief Bernard, do you share that view?
Yes, I do. And I think that I do want to just note before I know he's closing in 2 seconds, we have Resolution 73-2023 that was passed at the AFN last year at the General Assembly that I would like to submit if I'm allowed to. And also I have the document on the Standing Committee from 2006 that the Standing Committee, this was in reference to the procurement strategy, and if the people around the table who are making these decisions have received this document, and if not, am I able to submit it?
Chief Bernard, I'm sure the committee would appreciate you tabling both of those documents for our review as part of this study. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll hand the floor back to you.
Mr. Bachrach, yes, I'll get you in a second, Mr. Generous. Mr. Ducharme and Chief Bernard, thank you very much for joining us. You've both been wonderful witnesses. We've gone through this study partially in 2018, and I'm still learning some more on the issue, and you've brought some very important things forward for us to work on. I hope we'll see you back at OGGO one day in the future where we're celebrating fixing this system. But thank you very much.